नमस्ते, मुझे जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल में शिरकत करने से बहुत खुशी हुई. My name is Margaret MacLeod. I'm First Secretary for Public Diplomacy at the U.S. Embassy in India. Thank you everyone for joining us today at the Jaipur Literature Festival. I'm excited to learn through the panels and conversations at the festival, not only from the people of India, but from people around the world, about challenges and opportunities that we face. With our participation, the U.S. Embassy aims to highlight some of the shared challenges, not just for the United States government or for both our countries, but again, for the entire world. This year, we're exploring such challenges and opportunities related to the blue economy. With vast populations dependent directly or indirectly on them, oceans are critical assets. They're a habitat to millions of species, a vital carbon sink, and a key determinant of environmental and human health. The oceans also provide an essential source of food, support tourism and recreation, and enable global trade. Those same oceans disproportionately bear and exhibit the impacts of climate change. From sea level rise to ocean acidification, significant changes in ocean current patterns, for instance, can affect ocean health and threaten the availability of fish stocks and bear on coastal communities that depend on these resources. The many impacts of climate change on oceans are therefore immensely complex and interrelated. However, there's a lot we can learn from these observed impacts that use that knowledge to prepare our economies to be resilient and sustainable. We can deploy the superpower of our oceans to combat climate change and work towards reducing the damage caused by unchecked human activities. Oceans are the largest heat sink on the planet and absorb about 90% of the excess heat caused by climate change. Oceans are also a very efficient carbon sink, absorbing 23% of human-caused carbon dioxide emissions. However, this absorptive capacity is directly affected by ocean health, which is in turn affected by climate change. Coastal zones are very high energy areas. The forces of tides and waves can be used for sustainable power generation. And coastal ecosystems like mangroves are not only support fisheries and biodiversity, but also strengthen the ability of coastal communities to withstand the impacts of climate change, reducing the rise in seawater levels during cyclones and bringing down the water inflow speed. Our growing need for ocean-derived food, materials, and energies is fueling next-generation maritime, or blue, technologies. Industries like ocean observation, for example, are moving further offshore to take advantage of and capture data across the vast scale of the ocean. These are just a few of the many ways that oceans act as saviors, not just for coastal communities, but for all of us on planet Earth. With that, I look forward to hearing more from our panelists on this fascinating topic, and I look forward to an informative and engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Martin, Merlin, and Sejal, thanks very much for being on this somewhat eclectic panel, where we're missing an ocean scientist who had to step out of the discussion just late last night. So we'll try and weave our way through that. And I'm going to begin from my extreme right with Martin, only because we had a quiet session just before this one. And Martin was talking to me about his first experience of scuba diving, and how he said this was like an alien world. And this phrase really struck me, because we do know that the bulk of the Earth's surface is occupied by water, by blue oceans, and yet we know so little about it. You dwell a little bit on that for me, Martin.
Yeah, yes, sure. It's, oceanographers always say that we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the deep ocean. We were just talking about how little we know about the fungi in the ocean. I'm sure you'll be talking more about that, Merlin. So I think that it seems to be a fact that the ocean is underexplored, even though it's so hugely important. But when we were chatting beforehand, I suppose I was talking more about a personal experience of when you scuba dive, you're suddenly in this three-dimensional world where you, depending on how you breathe, your buoyancy changes, and it's just a completely different way of moving through a three-dimensional space. And then you have the world around you that's different. And I think that's what, so maybe alien is not the right word, but it's a completely different or unexpected way of moving in a very different medium, water, that allows for a very different kind of experience of three-dimensionality, I suppose. And for me, above all, it was that the fact that the way you breathe changes how you float. That's not how we move around on land.
It is how we move around, in a sense, on the moon, right?
I suppose so.
Yeah, completely different sense of weight and so on, and therefore alien. Merlin, as somebody who studies fungi, would you say the same is true of fungi, that we know very little about the fungi in the ocean?
Certainly. And also, just to reflect briefly on what you were just saying, I've always been very struck by a line from Alexander von Humboldt, who thought of the atmosphere, the air atmosphere in which we live, as an ocean of air. Because the difference between an air and a liquid, both are fluids. Air is a fluid and liquid is a fluid. And the difference between them is liquid is an incompressible fluid. So for Humboldt, we are living in an ocean of air, and we're bottom feeders on an ocean of air. And birds are swimming in that ocean of air. And by this extension, I guess we are flying in the ocean when we are scuba diving in that way. And I just find this a helpful perspective shift, and so much of the way that we talk about ocean depends on our perspective. And there are so many ways to think about how we navigate these spaces, both in terms of area and in terms of depth. When it comes to fungi in the ocean, fungi are organisms that I have a special fondness for. And they are remarkably important organisms in the whole biosphere. And we know very little about them when it comes to the ocean. And one of the things we do know about them is that they make possible the lives of many seaweeds that spend time in intertidal zones. These seaweeds are able to, intertidal zones are extreme environments. These seaweeds have to withstand cooling and drying cycles, extreme heat, unfiltered solar radiation, and then going back into the water. And this is made possible by their symbiotic relationships with fungi and bacteria. And so I guess this leads us to the view of oceans as the sites of great intimacies, great intimate relationships about which we know very little.
Sejal, how did you start studying intertidal species, and what has been your relationship with the ocean, both before and after?
So I'm a Bombay girl, so the ocean sits very close to me. And if you're familiar with life in Bombay, we're so involved in the daily functioning of getting through the day that we forget about something that is so vast, sitting right at our periphery. And it becomes too comfortable. It's like a family member, that you kind of take for granted after a while, and you forget to see its magic. But I think it's there all the same. And the reason actually that I stepped on an intertidal zone for the very first time is because I thought some marine biologists had lost their minds. Because I was the editor at a magazine in Bangalore, and I started hearing about this group of scientists who are walking on the shores of Mumbai looking for wildlife. And anyone familiar with Bombay's shores knows that the first thing that comes to mind is crowds, plastic, pollution, sewage. I was like, no self-respecting wildlife is going to be in Bombay's coastal areas. They're just getting excited over a few crabs. It's not possible. All my journalistic cynicism came to the fore. But of course, I went to check out the story, and I had to eat some very revolting humble pie. Because I have to tell you that Bombay's intertidal zone and intertidal zones across the country, we have a 7,500 kilometer coastline, is brimming. This coastline is brimming with wildlife, with marine life. So while you talk about depths and and you brought us to the intertidal zone, I think it's so less studied in that sense in public domain. Of course, scientists have been looking at intertidal zones for years. But I think as Citizen Science and Marine Life of Mumbai, a group I worked with in Bombay, is an open forum which kind of documents biodiversity on shorelines. And we found interesting creatures with superpowers. So there are cone snails, which are assassins, and hermit crabs, which are, and the thing about the connectivity that you spoke about is that I think it brought me very close to understanding the ocean. And I think what that does is, I think when you engage with something, with as simple as a shore walk, you walk on a coastline, it's as simple as that sometimes. And when you engage with something, and you slowly start to understand it, and understanding at some point will lead to empathy. And empathy will definitely lead to protection. So I think that sort of bridge is what this walking with these scientists kind of brought.
That brings me directly to what, in a sense, is your current remit, Martin, which is about the role of literature in helping us understand the environment, and perhaps, if that's not too grand and ambitious a word, saving it.
Yeah, as you're saying, I'm a literary scholar, so I've been sort of watching the way we tell stories about the environment. And when it comes to the ocean, I think there are a couple of ways we default to. And the first, probably the oldest story about catastrophic climate change, or one of the oldest, is the story of the flood that first appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first longer written texts in world history. And then, of course, it migrates into the Hebrew Bible and then into the Christian Bible, which is an apocalyptic change, the ocean as threat, chickens coming home to roost. I'm now mixing metaphors, as a kind of the earth rebelling against our sinful behavior. And I think that paradigm is still very strong in all these catastrophic apocalyptic climate change movies and some stories, that there's somehow this huge threat. Ocean rise is one of them. Then the framers of this panel rightly pointed out that the ocean is often seen as a victim, acidification and so on and so forth. And as I understand, the description of this panel is a change from victim to savior. And I think those two figures are also very strong in climate discourse. We're very quick to identify different victims of climate change. We perhaps desperately look for saviors. So I don't have a solution here. I'm just pointing out it's interesting, especially when it comes to the ocean, but not only there. Very strong idea of threat on the one hand, victim, and savior. And sometimes I wonder whether those are the right figures to use, whether we should populate the stories about climate change with these strong figures, or whether we need to come up with different kinds of stories about it.
Would you care to speak to that, Merlin? And the possible role of the ocean as a savior, not just as a victim.
Well, I suppose I think of it more in terms of fluid flows. I went out a couple of years ago in British Columbia in a Zodiac boat to spend time with some tidal rapids. And at certain times of day, the tides are forced through these narrow channels between small islands and create walls of water, standing waves, and enormous whirlpools that suck down logs and spit them up again from the middle. And you see sea lions basking and hanging out in these places because they're stirring up all sorts of nutrients from below and are great feeding places. But it was clear to me then that oceans are, tides are, when a tide comes in or goes out, that water is coming from somewhere and it's going to somewhere. And the world's oceans are like a giant river that we don't normally notice because until you see it rushing through a tidal narrow, I hadn't realized. So I think about those flows and I think about that dynamism. And I also think about the way that the places where ocean has been but is no longer. For example, the Sahara, when I was working in Panama in the jungle there, one of the questions is, what's fertilizing on these old soils? What's fertilizing the growth of these fecund, diverse forests? And one of the things that fertilizes them is dust that blows over from the Sahara on atmospheric rivers. And that dust is made up of the bodies of old sea creatures that were deposited there when this was the bed of an ocean. So I think about ice. I think about the way that ice flows in the form of glaciers. Ice isn't just static. Ice is also, in some way, a fluid form. So I think about these fluxes when it comes to the ocean. I think about the places where the ocean has been, and perhaps the places where it might not always be. And so that shape-shiftingness, rather than locking it into a role.
Does that make you feel that this current popular narrative, which is that we are headed towards some kind of environmental disaster, that it's almost inevitable. Does it make you wonder whether that's inevitable, or that there are lessons, deeper lessons of eternal change that the climate has to teach us?
Well, I think any sustained look at the deep history of life reveals that what we can always count on is flux, is change, and the fundamental nature of spending time on Earth is that things change. And so the question we need to ask, I suppose, taking that perspective, is why do things remain stable? And what stabilizes conditions on Earth? And so yes, I suppose taking a deep time view, I see these fluxes we're entering as part of a larger system of fluxes, and like all the life forms that have persisted through these great traumatic events, our ability to do so will depend on our ingenuity to adapt, our ability to form new relationships with other life forms, with other humans, and to think in new ways about what it means to be alive.
So, to play the devil's advocate to this contemporary narrative that we're headed towards inevitable environmental disaster, is it also possible that we've lost our ability to contemplate change, that we are so invested in the status quo? Anybody like to comment on that? I can see Martin nodding away.
I'm nodding that it's a great question. I'm not nodding that I have a good answer, so I'll let someone else go.
I'll take a half-baked answer.
Well, I think that thinking about, Merlin, what you just said, it's not change, because change is everywhere. It's the rate of change, I guess someone could say, that's so threatening and startling now, because if you contemplate these changes over large time periods, they happen fairly slowly, and they were the occasional meteorite or some other sudden change, but it's the rate of change that's, and maybe, I don't know, that's not really an answer to your question, but maybe that's the thing we need to figure out. And that's always been a big problem of climate change, right, is time scales, that in some sense these changes, even though they are rapid in geological time, they're very slow for our very short attention spans. So I think there's a problem there that has to do with time and rate of change and speed and those things.
Sejal, what did your walks in the intertidal zones teach you about resilience of species?
So I also want to add to, so the first thing is, I've actually never seen the ocean as a victim at all. I think and anybody who studies it will know that the power lies with the ocean. I think it's our job to probably try and understand it, because we want to protect anything that we want to protect, I think, is for our own good. I think the ocean is fine, in the sense that it'll figure it out. So to also reply to whether or not we are headed towards environmental disaster in that sense, I think I'm not really sure about that, and scientists can add to it. But we are definitely, it is also the historical value of documentation and science, that we see things that have, as Martin said, over longer periods of time, where small things like ocean currents and seem small to us, but what I'm saying is like cooling temperatures, warming temperatures, 2 degrees here, 2 degrees there, can wipe out entire species. So it's very, very powerful, right? And what it does to the coast, and this is something that I just said earlier a little bit about how it's very comforting that the ocean is there and we forget about it. But as an intertidal zone, it's easy to forget this, that the ocean is changing the coastline every single day with the tides. Every time the tide comes in, it takes something back, it puts something in its place. And by this very, very action, it changes landscapes and coastlines over millions and millions of years. So there's a lot of history there. So when we try to document resilience, on intertidal zones especially, I think what is really, really startling to me is that when I walk on a beach or when I walk on a coast, like some of the rock faces in Konkan, in Maharashtra, are like 65 million years old. And Bombay's, the scientist said to me that Bombay is a little younger. It's 62 million years young. And I was like, that sounds about right. So in that sense, timescales are so different. But the resilience of it, when you think about it, when you think about the simple act of walking, as I said, I think that when coastlines shape things like this, they also affect our lives, right? So there are these historical references. We talked to the fishers of Kolivada in Thane, And they talk about their ancestral lands as if they're talking about agriculture lands. So they say कि हमारे खेत खराब है. In the same way, they say that the ocean is changing their lands, which is small little fishing grounds they have. They call them such. And this kind of change is historical language. It's traditional language. That is also important. So if you ask them a question, they won't reply in terms of years. They'll reply in terms of tides. They'll reply in terms of catastrophes. They'll reply in terms of ocean events. That when this happened, we had to do this. When this happened, we moved to this place. When this happened, when the tsunami hit, this is what happened. So I think there's also a traditional language of resilience that is historical value. So when you walk on a beach, and then you also think about when I said that the rock faces are so old, an intertidal zone, and when next time you walk on a beach, you try and remember this, that you think that this is the remnant of what once was, right? It's a result of volcanoes. It's a result of like when the earth shook and raged, when things were molting like hot, and now has cooled down into this intertidal zone. So when you're walking on it, you're walking on pages and pages of history in some way. Like there's so much that has happened. There's diatoms, there's microorganisms, there's fish poop, there's coral rubble. So much has accumulated and has now become the sand or the coastline that you walk on. And that is a super sign of resilience, right? That means that something survived, that all of this is here. So when you walk on and something it's so easy to see it, it's so visible, that there is a creature on the intertidal zone called a limpet. Okay, what it does is, it's one of the few creatures on the intertidal zone that has a homing tendency. So it kind of forages, and then it comes back to a home, which is not very common on an intertidal zone with animals. And when it keeps coming back to, then it's a hard animal. So when it keeps coming back to the same place, it sort of makes a little home for itself. There's an indentation that happens. Over time, there's gravel that accumulates on it. Over time, something happens, and 200 years later, you're walking on that beach, and you'll see that little cup in that stone, and you'll be like, what is this? It's basically his historical reference of an animal that was here. So when you walk on a coast, in terms of resilience and time zones, you see that it's so long, the time scale is so different that it's a resilience at its best in some forms.
Lovely. One of my deepest sort of insights, if you could call it that, as a scuba diver, was to go into a wreck. And the wreck was maybe 25 years ago, which is just a tiny, tiny blip in any form of history, especially natural history. And to see how nature had taken over. There were coral, there were sea fans, there were anemones, there were fish which had made little clusters in portholes and in the engine room, and it was almost as though man didn't exist. Man didn't matter. Left this brief disturbance on the floor of the very shallow sea, and then nature just took over again. So the same story of resilience of nature. Is there anything you'd like to share, Merlin?
Well, I mean, I think it's helpful to take the long historical view here, and to, if we cast our minds back to about 500 million years ago, plants had not yet made their way out of the water and onto the land. So the land was a scorched, inhospitable place, very, very hot, huge fluctuations in temperature by day and by night, dusty, nothing we'd think of as soil. A few crusts, extremophilic fungi and algae and bacteria living in this very shallow kind of way. But in the sea, life was booming. There were 9-foot-long sea scorpions, trilobites with spade-like snouts ploughing the floor of the ocean. Mollusks were thriving. Corals started socializing into reefs. And this was such a long time before anything remotely cosmopolitan kicked off on land. So I think when we take this kind of perspective, it becomes clear that the oceans are not just museums of diversity, but cradles of diversity, the places where life forms come into being. And so in the face of these great fluxes, we can also think of them as the new birthplaces for new forms of life that will come out of the face of these terrifying challenges that we're talking about now.
And to also just the resilience that you spoke about, there is and coral, you mentioned corals and sea fans. So there are sea fans in Bombay, and there's coral also. So it's basically a very resilient ecosystem. And I was speaking to the researcher, Ram Vilas Ghosh. He works on corals and sea fans. And every research paper in the universe has said that sea fans require very, very pristine water. And he came to Bombay to do some sort of documentation, and he found them outside the biggest sewage pipe in Bombay. And he made a panic call to his scientist friends, and he's like, what are they doing in Bombay? But they are here, and they are thriving.
So, one of the great victims when we portray victims of environmental change, one of the very touted victims of warming was the Great Barrier Reef and the death of corals there. But we are now reading from the Australian Nature Department that there's been a resurgence. The coral has come back. And this brings me to the question of literature, Martin, which is that the broader sort of sense of literature, the written word, which includes the media, on which side would you sort of tend? Is it overplaying the negative consequences of climate change, or is it also heralding disasters which may not come to bear?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think in some ways both are true. I mean, of course there is a lot of complacency, and I understand that those who care about climate change and worry about it use shock strategies to get people out of complacency. A few months ago, I was working with a group of climate activists in Mosul, and who were actually interested in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of the flood, and they felt like there was, to get any attention, they were very brave people, staged these, for in the main marketplace of Mosul, these sort of shock tactics to get people's attention, and we talked afterwards about that, and for them that seemed like the only thing possible. But I do think that these shock tactics also, Extinction Rebellion has just said that they would no longer glue themselves to highways or to paintings, and I suppose no one has tried to glue themselves to the ocean yet. And so I think there is a kind of reassessment on a purely strategic form of these kinds of shock and catastrophic stories, and I think that's right. I think that's an important assessment. But it's also still unclear what should take their place, because we have defaulted to them so much. But I think from this conversation, I think a couple of pointers have emerged of maybe smaller stories about rethinking the ocean or the coastal waves or different timescales, and I think that strikes me as the right direction to go into.
And I think also relatability. I think we tend to, yes, of course, there is enough to worry about, and we must write about those things. But I think there's also room for fascination. There's also room for some sort of awe. And there is also room in storytelling for, making something so, as you said in the beginning, it seems such an unfathomable space, to make it a little more relatable. And when you start doing that, I think that's when people start to engage with it. Otherwise, they'll just be like, I don't understand it, I don't want to deal with it. But when stories start, like if you talk about, there's a hermit crab in Bombay, and the hermit crab is, it's not a true crab. So it has to find shells that are abandoned from other creatures to protect its carapace. And then it grows larger, and then it has to find a new shell and a bigger shell. So a kind of a constant potential real estate is always on the horizon for this crab. Now, how much Bombay can you get, right? How more Bombay can you get? When you tell these stories, immediately people are, they smile and they're like, yeah, that's true, that's just like me. And when you say that, and when that feeling comes that, oh, it's breathing the same that I'm breathing, and it's kind of, there's an empathy that happens. And I think that sort of relatability and empathy, that bridge when you build, I think that's when people start to engage in the stories that you're telling them.
On this note of relatability and on this note of story, some things that have been fascinating me recently about the ocean is I learned from my brother. My brother's an acoustic ecologist and a musician, and And so he spent a lot of time working with recordings of the creatures who live in the sea. And many of these recordings, turns out, were made by the American military during the Cold War, because submarine captains had to work out whether this extraordinarily strange noise they could hear was a fish or a Russian submarine. And it turns out that all of the strangest noises were fish noises. So he's got this amazing archive and he makes songs with them. But one of the things that he's been telling me about is that there are some coral reef scientists who have worked out that in a reef that has died and has become encrusted with algal blooms which suffocate the life from the reef, if they play using underwater speakers the sound of a healthy reef in and around this stricken reef, then it attracts back the fish who come to graze the algae, and then it attracts back the next level of organisms who need to be there, and you can restore the life to a reef just by playing the sound of a healthy reef. And this is all, right, this is all to do with us paying attention to the forms of communication that these organisms are using to interact with one another. And I think this is a massive part of storytelling, is to be a listener, to more than human stories, and then eventually learn to participate in those.
Which takes us right back to the role of literature in saving the environment. That's, in a sense, the central thesis of your recent book, right, Martin? Would you care to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I think when I talked about the different kinds of stories we tell about the environment, from the catastrophic flood stories to recent stories, I was sort of sketching that. So I don't want to necessarily repeat that. But if I may, I wanted to pick up on this question of awe. And since I've been kind of speaking dismissively of sort of catastrophic climate change movies coming out of Hollywood, I've been sort of waiting for someone on this panel to bring up Avatar, The Way of Water, which I saw in Mumbai, was playing in the theaters there. And what struck me about it, and this comes back to the sense of awe, is that, so you have an army of special effects people and so on and so forth, trying to come up with like the most outrageous sea creatures and plants and so on and so forth, because that's what the movie, what the first movie, the land-based movie, was so great at, imagining these life forms. And what they came up with in The Way of Water, with 3D and everything, pales in comparison to a short scuba diving trip on a coral reef. And you just realize that, though, it is a movie that plays on awe, rightly, but it's amazing how pitiful it is in comparison to what is actually in the ocean.
What you can see in 45 minutes without even really knowing the ocean. Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. There was another point, Martin, which is that do these apocalyptic stories act as a disservice to the cause of the environment?
I'm starting to think that they do, at least in many respects. It's shocking to me how little, and I say this as a critical remark about my profession, literary criticism, how little we actually know about the effects of different kinds of stories on people. I think there are a lot of assumptions people have been making and are making. And so one of the assumptions was, well, we need to shock people out of complacency. But I've started to doubt the effectiveness of that. But again, also more based on I suppose, anecdotal evidence than on actual quantitative studies. So I think we need to study the effects, sometimes indirect effects, long-term effects, surprising effects of different kinds of stories on people. But the conclusion I've taken away from it is that we need a much wider range of stories, and what you've just been saying about the listening to non-human stories, I think goes very much alongside, and the kinds of superhero stories you've been telling about these sea creatures also strikes me as going in that direction, that we need a much broader panoply of stories, in part because they, I think, are likely to speak to different kinds of readers, but they also change our imagination, so we don't always default to just one or two or three types of stories when it comes to the ocean and the environment in general.
Yeah, my instinctive reaction when you were talking about apocalyptic stories this morning is that, in a sense, it sort of puts me in a place of lacking agency. that if there are these massive forces which are inevitably going to overcome the planet, then there's really nothing that I can do about it. And in a sense, it could be very, very counterproductive. So my response would be, we need stories where you can actually conceive of agency at an individual scale. I can see you're smiling, Merlin.
I completely agree. I mean, if you think about our narrative diets in our own lives, imagine if you only watched one type of movie, apocalyptic movies, or only read one type of book, apocalyptic books, or just watched love stories or heard love stories. We'd end up quite bored, and it would start to shift, it would start to limit our imaginal potential. So I think we generally have quite broad narrative diets, which is why you can see so many different types of film and book being written. And I think we should apply the same reasoning to these environmental challenges that we face. And sure, there's a time when we need to take on board the urgency of the problem and the potential consequences of inaction. And yet, most of the time, I think we need to have stories about the extraordinary opportunities that we face in this time of crisis, and to look at the ways that other organisms have risen to these wild challenges of living over the course of the history of life, and indeed that they're doing right now, today, in front of us.
Wonderful. A last word from you, Sejal, before we throw the floor open to questions.
I think I'll just kind of add to just that in terms of different types of stories. And I really like what you said about sometimes you feel, what can I do? It seems such a massive problem. And that's where different types of storytelling does come in. But also, I really appreciate places that I find information that I can act upon. So for example, I was at a festival just like this, and there was a birder who was giving a presentation on his work. And he talked about an interesting concept called patch birding. And I have since taken it to all sorts of wildlife watching. He talks about not worrying about like a larger problem for the minute. He says, find a patch. It can be a plant in your windowsill. It can be a beach you walk on. It can be the park that you frequent. Make that your patch of observation and exploration. It seems very simple. It seems simplistic also, but it's actually not. Because when you engage with something over a year, 2 years, and you start seeing, for example, you're all stuck in during COVID, and there was a bat roosting site opposite my house, and I had no option but to just look at that. We're not used to watching bats. They're not charismatic creatures. The worldview is literally opposite. So, you're not like, I don't know what they're doing, but my interest in them, and they're really loud, so you can't ignore them. But my interest in them started to build over that year, and then of course I'm a writer, so I wrote about it, and I found unbelievable things happening right in the tree that I kind of watched every day. And I think that is powerful. So when you have a patch of your own and you see the seasons change, and while like the legendary Bombay monsoon kind of completely lashed down on these creatures, I wondered, oh my God, how are they holding on? And I found out that they have a claw mechanism. And I was like, oh my God, aren't they getting wet? And I found out that their the wings, they excrete this particular chemical that acts as a wind cheater. And these are the small things you come to know about the creature, and then you're like, oh my God, it's so noisy. They're right outside a hospital. How are they dealing with this? Urban ecology. Slowly, without knowing it, you are understanding your surroundings. And now imagine that patch becomes your exploration. Now imagine you have several patches. Now imagine lots of you having so many patches. If everybody just tends to that, I think at least we will have, I'm not saying this will solve a large problem, but it is definitely a gateway into understanding larger problems that we think don't concern us right now. Like what's happening in the ocean, kya pata? Like I know people who think climate change is something that's happening in cold countries. It does not affect us. And I don't blame them. It's actually, we need to tell better stories that can relate that problem to my own life. I think that is important.
Cultivate intimacy.
You have to.
Create
otherwise.
a patch, put a bird bath out there. Yeah. Questions, please. We have about 5 minutes. Is that by way of saying we don't have questions? Yeah, the gentleman here. Can you get a mic to him in the fourth row? Yeah.
I was wondering, these narratives you're talking about, for adults, just like the gentleman told us, that because their imagination is crystallized, they see it from a particular lens. But how about training the next generation where you can create a palatable narrative, like, let's say, for example, Finding Nemo, where you're associating the ecology of the underwater and sensitizing children. What are your thoughts about that?
Martin.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it. I'm just actually in conversation with some people who want to start a climate change writing competition or prize or incentives for children's books. So I think you're absolutely right. And as we all know, I said earlier, we know very little about the effects of stories on people, but I think we can say one thing for sure from our own experience, that the stories we read as children and young adults have huge impact. So I want to completely endorse what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the wonderful discussion. As a climate scientist who's been working in this field for about 20 years, it sounds very optimistic discussion, admittedly. And I do understand that most of you are very skeptical about the shock and awe statements that the younger generation has been making. But do you not think that it's as a response to the slightly older generation saying that everything around us is resilient and hence what we are doing is not going to have that much of an effect, whereas all the data shows that it is having an effect, even though there are anecdotal stories where it might be optimistic? So do you not think in terms of storytelling, we are doing a much better job at telling the positive stories as compared to the reality which calls for action without a drastic change such as gluing yourself to painting?
Sejal seems to have a reaction, please. Sorry, Sejal. Sorry.
No, I actually definitely think that there is value in shock and awe, but I'm saying that it needs to we need to tell multiple range of stories. So there should be children's books that talk about fascination, that talk about education. There should be climate urgency. So I'm saying, I'm not denying the need for that. That I feel is already happening, and is happening actually rather well. Like, we have journalists right here who write extremely powerful stories. But I'm saying there is a need to also have relatability and a slight positive gateway into people who have still not, when you tell somebody that chalo sab mar raha hai, they will probably not engage, like he said. But if you give them 3 stories to read, maybe there might be some engagement. If they give them multiple avenues. So I completely agree. There is no, it is a horrible situation. We are in trouble. The ocean is definitely, which is what I said in the beginning, that band to hamari bajegi. Sorry, I'm shifting to Hindi sometimes, but it is going to come to us only. So the reason to tell these stories is also to kind of get more people involved. Because if we only talk about the shock, I think a lot of people that could be allies will not even reach here. Like, I know that when I tell stories at the shore walk, people, when they say, oh wow, I never say to them, dekho yahan pe so much plastic is there. It is implied. They are standing there, they're watching a fiddler crab using plastic. They're seeing a hermit crab using a tennis ball as a shell. So they are seeing this. It does not need me to actually say that, see, he's using, how sad. It's not always necessary, but yes, to say definitely that it is an immensely scary situation in the ocean. But also to say we will get affected by it, not so much the ocean.
Thanks, Sejal.
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is, would you consider ocean sea creatures and sea life to be a part of the ocean when you're considering whether or not the ocean is a victim? Because while you can say the ocean is certainly very resilient, the creatures that live in it are definitely suffering greatly from the algae blooms and plastic pollution and ocean acidification that's going on in the world right now.
She said, you talk about resilience, that may be at a systemic level, but individual species are getting affected. Was that your question, right?
But they are getting affected.
I don't think there's any doubt on that. Nobody is trying to make.
Was there a question we missed? Did you get it?
No, that was really. It was more like a submission, I think.
Yes.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
definitely.
yeah. Please, last question here.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting to hear all the stories. I just want to ask that along with these stories where you're talking about the sea creatures and all, I would just like to point out that there's people living on these shorelines and the fringes. So how do we build a narrative or the stories in terms of those people, because their lives are getting affected the most, and they are the front, people who will be facing all these issues. And while they keep waiting for the funds and, a lot of talks are happening. So how do you see these stories along with the things that are happening, their life being changed, and what we can do as in small ways to actually also involve them and to see how their lives are changing with these narratives and these stories. I would just like to hear.
Martin?
Thanks.
I'm not sure I'm the obvious person to answer that, but to say you're absolutely right, and I do think that there has been more attention, but quite recently paid to that under the headline of climate justice, really looking at the kinds of communities that live in these areas that are most affected, and the fact that the effects of climate change that are happening right now are so unequally distributed. So I think that there has been an attempt to collect stories, maybe along the lines that you were describing earlier, from these communities. How do they talk about? And I think your stories about the fishermen in Bombay are an example of that. Seeing how they respond, how they see it, how different agencies, including the state and NGOs, can support them. So I think that's important, and that was long, more or less missing from the climate discourse. But I think it is changing, and the fact that you are raising this question here shows that there's more awareness. But it's true that's something that hasn't come up on the panel. So thank you very much for raising this.
Yeah, I think a lot of the climate discourse has been very top-down, and in a sense you're advocating that there should be a lot more from the bottom up. We've clean run out of time. Thanks so much, Martin, Merlin, and Sejal.